welcome back to Crime in Court. This is the 1996 Menendez brothers retrial. Erik and Lyle Menendez on trial for the homicides of their parents, Kitty and Jose. We are on the defense's case, part 20. We're moving on to the next witness, who is, so we just completed Ron Linhart, who was a criminalist. He was originally consulted in the first trial, and he was not called by the prosecution this trial. And he talked a lot about the ballistics, the blood pooling and things like that in the crime scene. So we're moving on now to a forensic and criminal pathologist, Dr. Charles Morton, for the defense. Their next witness. It is the afternoon coming back from a recess. So this is like the very tail end of the day of November 30th. And the court says everyone is present. Oh, I gotta shrink myself. Sorry about that. Please hit the like button and let's get started. All right, the court says everyone is present. We'll have the jury out, please. The jury enters the courtroom and the following proceedings were held. Okay, the defense may call its next witness, says the court. Ms. Abramson says, thank you, Your Honor. The defense calls Charles Morton. Charles V. Morton was called as a witness by the defense, was duly sworn in, and testifies as follows. Clerk swears him in, and now direct examination begins. Ms. Abramson says, Mr. Morton, what is your occupation? And are you employed by a public agency? Or are you a private industry? Private. And what is the name of the private business that you are a part of? It's the Institute of Forensic Science Criminalistics Laboratory, actually a series of 3 separate laboratories. The Institute of Forensic Science is a series of 3 laboratories? Yes. And what are the 3 different laboratories? There's my laboratory, which is criminalistics. There's a laboratory of forensic pathology, which does all of the work for the Alameda County Coroner's Office. And we have a toxicology lab, which does drug and alcohol work for the District Attorney's Office, Coroner's Office, Police Department, and California High Patrol. The reporter says, Your Honor, could I ask the witness to move the microphone down a little? They're really having hearing issues in this courtroom lately. Ms. Abramson says, also, go slow enough so that the reporter can get it without her finger smoking. The witness says, thank you. Ms. Abramson says, with respect to the Forensic Pathology Laboratory branch of the Institute of Forensic Science, is there a doctor in charge of that laboratory? Yes. And what is that doctor's name? Dr. Paul Herman. And with respect to the toxicological laboratory, is there someone in charge of that lab? Dr. Herman and Dr. James Meeker, toxicologist. And with respect to the criminalistics lab, who's in charge of that lab? And that's my lab. And when you say it's your lab, are you both the owner of it and the head of it? Yes. And how long, Mr. Morton, have you been a criminalist and forensic scientist? 32 years. What is your educational background that prepared you for this career? I have a Bachelor of Science degree in criminalistics from the University of California at Berkeley, and I also have a master's degree in criminalistics from the University of California at Berkeley. And when did you receive your master's degree from Berkeley? 1971. Now, you were in the courtroom when Mr. Linhart, a criminalist from the sheriff's department, testified to what criminalistics are. Do you agree with his definition, or would you expand on it? Or, yes, I certainly agree with it. It's a broad range of disciplines in which examination of physical evidence is involved. The one thing that you find is that different people have different specialties. Some people do almost exclusively drug and alcohol. Myself, I never have done any significant drug and alcohol work. When you say drug and alcohol work, that means the sort of chemistry of figuring out if a person has a particular drug or particular level of alcohol in their system. It's both the analysis of biological specimens for alcohol and other drugs, as well as the examination and identification of solid dosage forms. In other words, items that are suspected to be drug testing to see if they are, in fact, a particular drug or not, pills and powders and things like that. Okay, the stuff that's seized usually in drug arrests. Yes, so he tests those things in order to identify what it is. All right. So you've indicated that, however, the drug and alcohol area is one in which you have not been involved. What are the other areas of criminalistics in which you have been trained? My primary areas, actually, I was trained in drug and alcohol as well. I didn't do any of it. But the areas that I've been trained in, the broad area of criminalistics from fingerprints, trace evidence, which incorporates as hair fibers, soil, glass, those kinds of things, firearms, actually blood analysis. Early in my career, I did some serology, although subsequently I had on staff serologists who would do those analyses, and I got out of that field. I do blood spatter analysis. I do an overview of physical evidence to help identify what the problems are in terms of physical evidence in the case. This is with the objective of finding what kind of physical evidence is there, whether it can be used to tell about what happened in any particular incident. And so I might then form or farm out various problems or identify people who need to be involved in evaluating certain kinds of physical evidence that might be involved in that particular case. And when you say people who you might need to get involved, is that people who have a different area of expertise than your own? Yes. And typically, if you're trying to answer the questions of finding out what happened in a particular crime scene, and part of the physical evidence are wounds on human bodies, is there a particular kind of additional person that you would want to bring in or talk to? Yes. Actually, in terms of wounds on bodies, I work closely with the Alameda County. Actually, I'm not so much with the coroner's office as with the forensic pathology group at our laboratory, which has a contract with Alameda County. We frequently refer to each other's expertise for the evaluation of wounds on the body. I get called to the coroner's office on occasion, and they ask me questions about various issues that have to do with wounds. And what are the issues that have to do with wounds where you are an expert? Firing distance generally is the primary one that I'm involved with. Sometimes the issue of sequencing has come up, and the pathologists have called on me for that. So there we have a specialty or a area of expertise that this particular expert is called upon often, and it is for firing distance, which is very helpful in this case. So he can try with his best guess and his his experience and um, technical knowledge. He can determine the distance of firing and also the sequence. So what order they were fired in, what order the wounds were inflicted. So he's a perfect witness for a crime like this that you would call in either side, the state or the defense, whoever's trying to, get to the bottom of everything is going to call in this kind of a witness to be able to look at that. So he's um, it's interesting that he's on the defensive side, though, isn't it? And when you're talking about the forensic pathology group, that's Dr. Herman's group. That's a part of the Institute. There are actually three companies that make up the Institute of Forensic Sciences. And did, in fact, you have any consultations with Dr. Herman consulting this case? Yes, I did. Did you have any consultations on this case with Dr. Martin Fackler? Yes, I did. And did you know of Dr. Fackler, in fact, before he became involved in this case? Yes, as a matter of fact. I think, yes, I've known him for quite a while. In fact, you suggested him to us. Yes. Wow. Okay. Now, after you received your master's degree from the University of California, Berkeley, what did you do for a career at that time? Well, actually, I went to work for Paul L. Kirk Associates in Berkeley. He was the professors who he was the professor who headed criminalistics program, and I went to work for him as an undergraduate. My last year at Berkeley, as an undergraduate, I worked in his private crime laboratory while I was working on my master's degree. I continued working for him until 1969, at which time I took position with the California State University at Los Angeles. In 69, I came down and took over the forensic science program, which is a master's degree program in forensic science at California State University in Los Angeles. Did you not yet have your master's yet when you did that? Correct. But you were teaching the master's program at California State in LA? How does that work? How is he teaching the master's program and he didn't have his master's yet? Usually, like, if someone's going to teach a master's program, you have to have a bachelor's. So, or I'm sorry, not a bachelor. If you're going to teach a master's program, you have to have a doctorate, and then only other doctorates can teach other doctorates. Only other doctorates can teach master's level, and only master's level can teach bachelor's level. Or no, I don't know. At least when I worked for an online university, that's how it worked for us. So, and that was in more recent days. So maybe things have changed since 96. So, anyways, you were teaching the master's program at California State LA. Yes. And how long did you teach the master's program at California State LA? Until 1975. So, in the interim, you obtained your own master's from Berkeley? Yes. And how did you do that if you were down here teaching? I flew back and forth a lot. Actually, I was just completing my thesis, so. Oh, that's the written paper you have to complete to get a master's degree? Yes. So you didn't have to go to class. That's correct. How do you know who is currently the head of the LA County Sheriff's Crime Laboratory? Barry Fisher. He's the technical head. I believe that these police departments have various levels of administration, but I think the scientific head of the lab there is Barry Fisher. You've seen in court the police head of the laboratory, or you've said in court, seen in court? I don't know. It says seen. You've seen in court the police head of the laboratory, Captain Soderberg? Yes. Who's been present during the testimony. Oh, okay. So he was in court viewing the testimony or listening to the testimony of Deputy Van Horn and Ron Linhart, the criminalist. And he says, yes, he has seen him. So, to your understanding, is Captain Soderberg a law enforcement head, the sworn deputy head of the lab? I'm not sure of the chain of command in that, but that's my understanding. But the technical head, the science head, if you will, is Barry Fisher. Yes. And do you know Mr. Fisher? Yes. And how do you know him? He was a student of mine. Was he a student in your master's program? Yes. And he was one of the master's candidates that you taught? Yes. In fact, Mr. Morton, are there a number of law enforcement employed criminalists who received their education from you at Cal State Los Angeles? Yes. I had students from Orange County, San Bernardino, Los Angeles Police Department, Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, Ventura Police Department, Ventura Sheriff's Department, quite an array of people, Riverside Department of Justice. I have students who are in all of those. Well, do you still do any teaching or training in the field of criminalistics and forensic science? Occasionally, I'm asked to put on a seminar for someone like a blood spatter. I was involved in a blood spatter seminar at a Department of Justice in at the Department of Justice in Sacramento. I get called upon to do things like that occasionally. Do you get called upon to do that both from members of government agencies and law enforcement, as well as for private criminalists? Yes. Actually, I don't think in that. I'm not sure if there are any private people in that program. I think they're all government. That particular seminar was for the Department of Justice, which is a prosecutorial agency, right? Right. And had you, in fact, in the course of putting on seminars, or, well, strike that, do the other branches of the Institute of Forensic Science, the doctors and the forensic scientists involved in those other branches, also put on training programs and seminars? The Institute of Forensic Science, as a group of the three companies, used to be twice a year, but now it's just once a year, put on a program where we invite people from around the state, everything from police officers and investigators and coroners, assistants to pathologists, criminalists. We put on an annual seminar. In the course of this teaching and training, did you make the acquaintance or get to know Dr. Lawrence? Yes, I believe that's where I met him the first time. He came to your training session? I believe so, yes. Now, after your teaching stint at California State, Los Angeles, that was 5 years ago? Yes. After those 5 years, what did you do? I went back up to San Francisco Bay Area to the Institute of Forensic Science, which at that time was one company, which was an offshoot of Western Medical Laboratories, a large clinical laboratory. It was subsequently bought out by one of another of a series of conglomerates which took it over and basically shunned it aside. The Institute of the forensic portion, which had become the separate entity, the Institute of Forensic Science and Western Laboratory, actually started back in the 30s and had been doing work for the district attorney's office and coroner's office there in Alameda County since back in the 30s. And in early 70s, I think it was, they split off the Institute of Forensic Science from Western Laboratories. So you went to work there for the Institute as an employee at that time? Yes. And what did you do for them as an employee? I was a criminalist who examined physical evidence and supervised others, serologists, and others who were doing examinations of physical evidence, working for an array of different agencies and attorneys, and last that lasted 1 year. And then I became division manager of the criminalist division of the company, which was basically it was the criminalistics division, pathology and toxicology. And at that time, I became division manager. Then a couple of years later, maybe it was a year later, I bought out that section and we set it up as three separate companies. So you bought the laboratory, the criminalistics laboratory at that time? Yes. Now, at some point, were you asked to join a prestigious national panel that was re examining the assassination of Senator Robert Kennedy? In 1975, I was one of the 7 firearms examiners from around the country that was selected to re examine the evidence. So one of seven firearms examiners from around the country was called to re-examine the Robert F. Kennedy assassination, and um, he was one of them. So that's pretty amazing. As a result, who was doing the selecting for that? Actually, some of it was done by the superior courts here in Los Angeles. I'm not sure all of the details of how it went on. They basically, each party in this lawsuit has to have the evidence. The case opened up and re examined, was given the opportunity to select somebody, and the other members would confirm whether that was acceptable to them. As a consequence of your work on that project, the re examination of the Robert Kennedy assassination, did you gain national prominence as a firearms expert? I guess you could call it that, yes. And you did then, and continuing to this present time, have you been retained by various individuals and agencies all over the country to lend your expertise to the reevaluation of crime scenes? Yes. And how many cases do you handle typically in a year, Mr. Morton? Somewhere between 250 to 300. Wow. That's more than a case every other day. Like it's almost a case every day, minus 65. So, I mean, he's not that far off from having a case like this every day on his desk. And are some of the cases more complicated than others? Yes. And as of this time, can you give us approximately how many homicide cases have you been involved in where you've been asked to re examine some or all of the physical evidence? I haven't kept track of it. I think my office manager looked the other day, and the last 5 years it was something like 300, and I expected that I'm approaching something like 1,000 homicides. Now, with respect to, in the last couple of years, were you involved in what's become a very controversial case having to do with the gentleman named Weaver who lived in a place called Ruby Ridge, and where there was a shooting involving federal agents and the Weaver family? This is a crazy story, which may or may not be related to Ted Kaczynski and all sorts of other things, MK Ultra, mind control, and uh what's the guy, David Koresh. All of these things lead back to Ruby Ridge potentially, with one family basically standing up to the government about something. So yes, he remembers the Weaver family. And were you retained as a firearms and criminalistics expert for one of the parties in that case? Yes, I was. And did you in fact testify in that case? The defense put on no defense. You were a defense expert in that case? Yes. And through your consultation, did you advise the defense attorneys in how to deal with the federal government testimony about their version of how that shooting occurred? Well, first, I requested to examine all of the evidence and the physical evidence of the scene or of the case because it was a mountain of it. No pun intended. Ruby Ridge was a mountain. They were on the top of a mountain. I didn't hear the pun. Maybe I'm falling asleep. Sorry. He says, I was asked to examine the evidence. So I examined it there in the state laboratory in Boise, Idaho. I was given access to the facilities there to examine it. And was the work that you did, was that work communicated by you to the defense attorneys for the trial? Yes, it was. And case in which was that case in which to a large extent the defense prevailed? Okay. Sorry. And the way it was worded kind of confused me there. He says yes. So it was the defense prevailed. And did that prevail on the issue? Did they prevail on the issue of undermining or contradicting the supposed reconstruction of the shooting that the federal agents had claimed occurred? I never tried to determine why people come to judgments, particularly juries. Good idea. Because they have a lot that I don't have and they have a different responsibility than I have. So I don't get involved in what their how their reach how they reach their judgments. Okay, fair enough. You're aware that there's been a congressional investigation into the Ruby Ridge affair? Yes. And focusing on how the actual shootings occurred? Yes. And some problems with physical evidence. There was some problems in this case. Uh, or sorry, there was some problems in this case, was there not? About ballistics evidence having been moved or replaced? Yes. By the federal agents? Yes. So the ballistics evidence was moved or replaced by the federal agents in this case. They basically, I think that they took this guy or this family out and then they covered their own butts. And why they took this family out, I'm not sure. I really haven't done a huge deep dive on into Ruby Ridge, but stuff like this fascinates me. And I know that a lot of stuff, there's tons of conspiracy theories about the Ruby Ridge case. Anyways, so he says yes, the federal agents covered up, lied, replaced, moved, whatever, however you want to call it, they did something with the ballistics evidence in this case. And they're failing to tell people that that had happened. That's correct. Now, are you also, in addition to actually doing your criminalistic and forensic science work, do you belong to various professional organizations in which you receive additional training and education and share information with other professionals in the field? Yes. And what professional organizations are you an active member in? The American Academy of Forensic Sciences, the California Association of Criminalists, the International Association of Wound Ballistics, and the California Association of Crime Laboratory Directors. And have you been an officer of any of these organizations? Yes. I was on the board of directors for 7 years, and I was a president of the California Association of Criminalists. Now, we just obviously indicated that in the Ruby Ridge case, you were testifying in the state of Idaho. Have you been qualified as an expert in criminalistics and forensic science in numerous state and federal courts? Yes. Can you just give us an idea of which states and which federal districts you've qualified in? Federal district, I think the Ninth Federal District in San Francisco and Guam. Ninth Circuit? Ninth Circuit, I'm sorry. So testified in Alaska on many occasions in Alaska, Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada, Arizona, Idaho, identified in Kentucky, Florida, Montana. Those are the ones that come to mind. And that's in both state and federal? Yes. And as a criminalist, what are your specific, well, I think you've told us that strike all of that. Have you qualified, first of all, as a firearms examiner and ballistics expert? I have. Have you qualified as an expert in blood spatter? Yes. Have you qualified as an sorry, have you qualified as an expert in trace evidence, hair, and fiber? Yes. Have you qualified as an expert in crime scene investigation? Not the field investigation. That's an area that, I mean, I have taught in that area, but I don't identify in the area of crime scene investigation. I don't testify. Oh my God, I can't read. I'm getting tired. So, um, my brain's just not functioning as well. But I don't testify in the area of crime scene investigation. He's taught it though. And that's because you don't work for a police agent? It's because I don't get to, well, I get to some crime scenes, but they're usually not hot crime scenes, as they call them. Everything's still there. So they're usually where everything still isn't there. That's correct. My interest primarily in the physical evidence, and I've taught classes. I taught when I went back up to Northern California at the Diablo Valley College. Team taught a course with someone from the Contra Costa County who is now with the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Lab. And we team taught a course on crime scene investigation. So I have quite a bit of experience with that, but I don't consider myself an expert on crime scene handling. I think that's an area of experience. I think that an an area that's experience helps out in. So when you say crime scene handling, does that mean in the areas of how to gather and store physical evidence from crime scenes? Yes. There's a whole process of roping off the crime scene, identifying areas that need to be evaluated, instituting a search, directing the search, calling the appropriate response people, such as the coroner's office, and all of that. So that's not an area because you don't get that opportunity to go to the crime scene and conduct those investigations in which you've really been called upon to testify? That's correct. What about the area of trying to figure out how things happened during the course of an allegedly criminal event, which has been called here reconstruction? That's largely what I do. I get cases sent to me from attorneys who basically have a lot of reports, a lot of photographs, a lot of documentation, and and there's evidence that needs to be examined. They want to know what all of this means, how to interfere it, or blah, blah, blah. Sorry, they want to know what it all means, how to interpret it, how to evaluate whether it's significant or not significant, how to re examine the evidence, and determine what it might tell. And do you start when you look over what's submitted to you on these calls, all of these various kinds of materials, photographs, documents, whatever, do you start out with a preconceived notion of what happened, or are you looking to find out? I spend a lot of time looking and primarily accumulating information during the early stage of the investigation, finding out what information is there, what information is missing, whether that information is still available, if it can be acquired, and trying to accumulate the all of it before trying to sit down and determine what may have happened. And have you ever seen it as your role, Mr. Morton? She calls him Mr. Why do they keep doing that? They keep going back and forth between the uh, pleasantries. Um, have you ever seen in your role, Mr. Morton, Dr. Morton, when you're doing this kind of examination of evidence to come up with a theory to support whichever side hired you in spite of what the real condition of the evidence may be? I'm surprised that wasn't objected to. He says that would never be something that I would approach. I'm basically trying to get at what the physical evidence is capable of saying about what did or did not happen. And in the range of cases that you have been involved in, does the physical evidence answer all the questions all the time? No. And does the ability of the physical evidence all the answer all the questions depend to start that over? Does the ability of the physical evidence to answer all of the questions depend to any extent on how complicated the crime scene is? That's one of the things it depends on, yes. And what are some of the other things that it depends on? How adequate the original investigation was, how adequate the documentation was, how well the evidence was collected and preserved, those kinds of issues. Whether or not the photographs show whether or not the photographs show everything that you'd like to have them show. Yes, or the diagrams show the location of evidence, whether all of the evidence has been collected, whether its location has been documented adequately. Now, Mr. Morton, how long have you been involved in this case? 1992. And in the course of your involvement in this, so he was involved since the first trial because the first trial took place in 93. So he must have been consulted, but I don't believe he testified. Or maybe he did. We'll find out, I guess. And in the course of your involvement in this, in all of that time, have you been court appointed to assist the defense counsel or appointed to assist the defense, correct? That's correct. So since the first trial, he's been court appointed, court appointed to assist the defense. And in the course of your involvement in this case, have you looked at all of at a lot of things? Yes, I have. And would you tell the jury what you don't have to mention each one, but what things you have looked at? I started out looking originally at photographs and requested access to evidence. I looked at physical evidence that was collected in the scene. Well, let me slow you down a little bit with respect to physical evidence collected in this case. Was one type of physical evidence collected what appeared to be parts of shotgun rounds? Yes. So-called ballistics evidence? Yes. And did you have those items physically in your possession for some period of time? Yes, I did. And where did you have them in your possession? At my laboratory in Oakland. And at your laboratory in Oakland, did you have available to you all the equipment that you needed to thoroughly examine that ballistics evidence? For the examination I did, yes, there's always more equipment that you can use. You can get a nuclear reactor and do nuclear analysis? Exactly. You don't have a nuclear reactor, do you? Did you? He says no. Did you also examine some items that have been identified as white plastic parts of a bracelet? Yes. Did you examine those as well in your laboratory in Oakland? Yes. And when you referred earlier to photographs that you had, were those both crime scene and coroner's photographs? Yes. So, in addition to those things, what else did you look at? Subsequently, I've looked at some CD-ROMs that had the photographic images, I guess, from all of the photographs taken in the case. I looked at a report by Failure Analysis Associates and, well, let me go back in time though. Previously, when you got the physical evidence, you got physical evidence from the scene. Did you also get any physical evidence that had been collected at the coroner's office? Yes. I'm sorry, I forgot about that. The ballistics evidence from the coroner's office, pellets and parts of shotgun cartridges that were removed from bodies and clothing. That's what we're going to get to. With respect to clothing, whose clothing did you get? Both Jose Menendez and Kitty Menendez. And did you do an examination of the clothing of the decedents again at your laboratory in Oakland? Yes. And how long was it that when you did your examination of the defendant's clothing? How long ago? June of 1993. June of 93? Yes. And are you the type of scientist, Mr. Morton, who does take notes? Yes, I do. And for every item of evidence that you examined, did you make notes of its appearance and any significant characteristics? I either documented verbal, in writing, or made some diagrams. Some things that, or photographs, I'm sorry, or photograph. And did you in fact take photographs of the various items of clothing at the time that you examined them in 1993? I took photographs of some of the items of clothing, but not all. And among the items of clothing that you observed was a shirt removed from Mr. Menendez, one of those items? Yes. Did you also examine a bra that was removed from Mrs. Menendez? Yes. Did you also examine Mrs. Menendez's pants? Yes, that she was wearing. And did you ultimately examine Mrs. Menendez's tennis shoes? Yes, I did. Did you examine those in 93 or more recently? More recently. Do you have, however, did you have, however, photographs of Mrs. Menendez's shoe? Yes, I did. And did you also receive reports prepared by Mr. Linhart, Deputy Van Horn, and Mr. Catalani, all of the sheriff's crime lab? Yes. Did you receive those reports back in 93? Yes. Did you also purchase a firearm back in to 1993 in order to do further work in this case? Yes. And what kind of firearm did you purchase? A Mossberg 5000 model 50406. Was it your understanding that the Mossberg 50406 was the model number of guns that Erik and Lyle purchased and used in this case? Yes. So he actually used the same gun as what is believed to be what the brothers purchased. And we know that because of, purchased gun firearm records, paperwork from the Big Five store. Have you seen the Mossberg 50406 that Dr. McCarthy obtained? Yes. And does the gun that you obtained appear identical to the one that he obtained? Yes. And you've had that gun for what, 2.5, 3 years? Yes. I'm sorry? 2.5 years. So 2.5 years. And in addition to getting a similar gun, did you get the same type of ammunition as what was used in this case? Yes. Which we know I believe Dr. McCarthy, was it his gun or is it the state's gun that had it wasn't quite the same model. It was similar but not quite. And then you've also got McCarthy using the wrong ammo and also miscounting it, misrepresenting the number of pellets inside. And was that Fiache 4 packed in the identical manner that the ammunition used in this case was packed? Yes. And did you in fact preserve and have with you in the box in which the ammunition that you obtained came from? Yes. Would you take that out for a moment? Mr. Morton, I'm removing from the bag, which is marked 313, a box and I believe is marked 313A. Look like the same? He says, yes, even the same price tag. Even the same, you mean the price tag hasn't gone up? He says, oh, I'm sorry, it's $5.59. It's gone up 40 cents. Either that or you bought it at a cheaper store. Could be. And you indicate there's some number and a date on the box that you have in front of you. Yes. And what do those signify? Well, that's my case number and the date that this was purchased. Sorry, my tongue, I'm just getting really tired. I think I get severe fatigue, which is hitting me like severely right now. So maybe I'll take a break and come back and continue recording because this can't be fun for you guys when I'm feeling fatigued. So, all right. So I'll be right back. You won't even notice, but I'm tired. So, and would you take that out for a moment, Mr. Morton? I'm removing from the bag, which is marked 313, a box, and I believe the box is 313A. look like the same? Yes, even the same price tag. Even the same. You mean the price hasn't gone up in, oh, I'm sorry, it's 5.59. It's gone up 40 cents. Either that or you bought it at a cheaper store. Could be. And you indicate there's some numbers and a date on the box that you have in front of you? Yes. And what do those signify? That's my case number and the date that that was purchased. And it shows that it was purchased in August of 1993? Yes. And if I were to tell you hypothetically that the box that's part of 313 was purchased on November 17th, 1995, would that indicate to you that they're still selling this stuff? Yes, it would. Now, is there anything else that you can recall that was submitted to you for your examination in this case that we haven't already covered? You mean in 1993? Either in 93, well, first of all, in anything else from that year? Reports. I already mentioned the reports, autopsy reports, police reports, diagram. The diagram that you're referring to, was that a Beverly Hills Police Department diagram? Yes. And have you, in 1995, recently received some additional diagrams that were prepared by the Beverly Hills Police Department? Yes. And what other materials have you reviewed that were submitted to you in 1995 prior to you coming to court today? I reviewed the report from Failure Analysis Associates, which I mentioned. I've reviewed transcripts, testimony transcripts from, well, whose testimony? Dr. McCarthy, Dr. Lawrence, and Dr. Fackler. Okay. Anything else you've reviewed? I've reviewed the CD-ROM, the photo CDs that have the images of all the negatives. And did you also review in the past few months one or two different versions of the failure analysis illustrations? Yes, I have. And was one version of those included in the CD-ROMs that you reviewed? Yes. And when you reviewed the photographs on those CD-ROMs, did you do it with a particular software program? Yes, I did. And what program was that? Photoshop 3.0. Adobe Photoshop? Yes. And were you informed that this was the program that Dr. McCarthy states that he used to look at the photographs? I did not. Did you guys know that Photoshop was around this long ago in 1996? Apparently it was, and a 3.0 version, in fact. So just a little interesting tidbit there. We're actually talking in the Delphi case about the alterations they made to the Bridge Guy video that they released to the public and the audio recording that they played on a loop, and how they actually had someone from Indiana State Police on the stand talking about how he altered that evidence. So technically, it's not real I mean, they altered it. So it's altered evidence. It's not original evidence, which makes it problematic for the defense, or for the state, I should say. And if they're doing that and altering, using computer software now, I can't, back here, like Photoshop was brand new. Now imagine what they can do with the software that they have. So just an observation. All right. And were you informed that that was the program that Dr. McCarthy states that he used to look at the photographs? He used Adobe Photoshop. I used it on a Power Macintosh, and I think he used it on an IBM. So I think it's a slightly different program, but essentially the same. It has the same capacity to allow you to look at photographs? Yes. And did you or did you find that looking at the photographs on computer was more helpful than looking at the hard copy photographs? Well, each procedure has its advantages and drawbacks. It's very nice to be able to take that many images and be able to look at them as if they were blown up or to a much larger size. So you can zoom in on a computer. And that's what you can do with the computer. You can focus in and blow it up. Yes, you can look at specific details, you can enhance them, you can increase the brightness or the darkness to get a better look at some things. But the thing you lose with that is the ability to lay them out at the same time or lay out as many as you need at the same time and interrelate or correlate variations in different objects. Whenever you have a number of different photographs of an object at a crime scene, you'll get a different perspective and it may tell you something about where it is or how it is in the scene or how it relates to other things. That is really much more difficult to do on the computer than it is with hard copy photos. And in your opinion, would it be even more difficult if you're a person who never takes notes about what you've seen? Objection calls for speculation. Sustained. A little dig at Mr. McCarthy for not taking notes. Ms. Amerson says, now with respect to the notion, Mr. Morton, of reconstruction, first of all, do you have an idea of how many homicide cases you've been involved in over the years? I think it must be getting pretty close to 1,000. Some of those are multiple homicides, as many as 25. Well, when you say some of those are as many as 25, that's like serial killing cases? Yes. So one homicide case could be 25 different homicides. That's correct. Do you have an idea of how many of those homicides involved firearms? I don't really have a very good idea, but I would say a fairly large percentage of them. More than 50%? Maybe not 50, but I would say it's probably close to that. So somewhere around 4 to 500, would that be a safe bet? Objection leading. Well, you can answer the question. Overruled. The witness says, that sounds pretty reasonable now that you mention the number. It sounds like it's probably more than that, but I have not kept track of the numbers. So probably over 500. So you think it might be more than 500 firearm related homicide cases? Could be. And have you, in some of those cases, been able to figure out how the shooting happened? Well, you can tell some of the things about how the shooting happened. Obviously, you can't get into the minds of the participants, but you can tell something about how they were interacting, the distance, the special relationships, that kind of thing. And what kinds of cases have you been able to tell those things, those kinds of things? If you could give us an example of a situation where you were able to figure those things out. Well, a simple example would be a shooting on the streets of San Francisco one time where all the witnesses said that the participants were at a certain distance apart. And the defendant, I believe, said that he was being attacked by this man who happened to be the boyfriend of his wife, I believe. And so he said they were in a direct confrontation, and as it turned out, the powder pattern on the clothing showed that they were very close to each other. So even though witnesses had them far apart, the powder pattern on the clothing showed that the shot was fired at close range? Yes. So that was really determining one aspect of physical evidence that resolved the issue that you were asked to investigate. That's correct. Would you say that that was a fairly simple task then to figure out at least that fact? Yes. Could you figure out, or was it necessary for you to figure out in that case at precisely what position either the shooter's body was or the decedent's body was when I take it was one shot? Yes. When the one shot was fired. No. As a matter of fact, that's one thing that is rarely possible because in order to establish a trajectory, even on a bullet, as opposed to to shotgun pellets, or even like shotgun pellets to some extent, is when you establish trajectory in a body. All it does is show the relationship between the body and the firearm, and it may tell you if you know the trajectory through the body and you have that, you know the trajectory through the body, and position of the firearm relative to the body. If you know and can establish to some extent the firing distance, then you can put the gun at a particular position relative to the body. So, at least a particular distance? A particular distance and in a particular orientation. There's all of these things have a little bit of uncertainty to them because defining an angle that precisely may not be that easy, but you can be within a matter of a degree or two. And the same way with the firing distance. So the trajectory could be off a couple degrees and the firing distance could be off. Like there's so many variables that it's impossible to know 100% is what he's getting at. And the same way with the firing distance, but the powder patterns, if you have the same gun, the same ammunition, you can determine the powder patterns so that you can say, well, this was about 2 feet plus or minus 6 inches, or 10 feet plus or minus 3 feet. So you can have some idea, but you still are getting a range. It's not precise. So that narrows down what the relationship is between the participants in this event, but it doesn't tell you much about where it is occurring because of the ability for the body to move. In other words, the relationship of the body to the gun is fired, or sorry, the relationship to the body. Let me start that. I'll go over. In other words, the relationship to the body to the gun is fixed. The body to the gun is fixed, but the information of the body can be quite variable, and that's particularly true when you're talking about limbs, because if you have a bullet coming into the head and you know precisely what the trajectory is, you don't know whether the person was looking like this or like that, up or down, up in the air, down to the ground, or whatever. All you know is that you have the bullet coming out this way, and there are a particular infinite number of positions that would allow. And if I can interrupt you for a minute, if there are an infinite number of positions of the head that would still show the same trajectory information, does that mean that there's a wide variety of places that the body carrying the head could have been and that the shooter carrying the gun could have been? That's right. It establishes a whole array of possibilities. Even if the situation where you have just one gunshot, it establishes certain information that is helpful, and it does establish a certain range of possibilities, which are relatively infinite in number if you take all the nuances. But if you take the realistic number of possibilities, it may limit you to a certain angle. There may be other things that restrict you within the environment. In other words, someone may be up against a wall, so you know that he wasn't out that way. So you know that the shot must have been fired somewhere out to a point where you come to another restriction or something else that limits you, or it may require that the gun, if you take that distance and the angle, it can't be up high because the person would have to be standing. On the ceiling? On the ceiling. But it may be, and you have this happen, someone was standing up on a balcony, so it could. So you have to take into account the environment where you're trying to reconstruct this and see how it limits or restricts what that says about that particular trajectory that you have. And so that's a limiting factor that you have. But what it particularly means is that when you do a reconstruction, what you're doing is you're setting the boundaries for what's realistic rather than saying what happened. You're trying, well, why can't you just say what happened? Because of the fact that there are too many possibilities that are variable within the same set of physical facts. You have the same set of physical facts that are consistent with the whole array of possibilities. Is that true even in cases where there's perhaps only one wound? Yes. So even in one, if there's one round fired, you can still have all these uncertainties. You still do have all of these uncertainties, and you can't be as precise as one would want you to be, especially in a case of, where someone's life is on the line. So to say that one round is going to cause this amount of uncertainty with a trajectory where you could be a few degrees off and you could also be, you could have infinite number possibilities of where the decedent and where the shooter were standing. Um, so you've got that for one wound, one round. And now we've got at least 11, 12, at least 10 wounds, but then we've got multiple other, wounds that aren't necessarily the entry wound. So you've got, other disturbances in the body. And then you're supposed to be able to reconstruct that when you have all of this stuff going on, especially with pellets. Pellets. And he said just a bullet itself can cause this uncertainty. But then you've got the pellets that scatter in all different directions. So I think the defense is making a really great argument so far with their witnesses. Every single one of them has said, you cannot reconstruct this. It's just too difficult. You can't do it. There's too many factors, there's too many uncertainties, and failure analysis is diagrams are just basically guesses. So, anyways, all right. So, is that true in cases where there's perhaps only one wound? Yes. And what happens when you've got a case where there are two wounds? As you add additional wounds, it adds additional complexity to the investigation or the assessment of the physical evidence. In some ways, and sometimes, it can actually help to define things even better. Other times, it makes it more complex. Well, give us an example of how it can make things, define things better. If you have, for example, two bullet holes to somebody and one of them goes all the way through and strikes something else, then you have a way of relating it to the scene. Or if it goes through a wall, you can say that this bullet hole goes through the wall. We know one of the bullets goes through and the other one does not. So this bullet hole goes through the wall. We can establish a trajectory on that wall, maybe 25 degrees down from or above the horizontal. It may be 8 feet, it may be, say, 2 feet off the ground, and it may be at a certain angle relative to the wall. So that establishes another trajectory that gives it something to the room that they can compare it to. That's not moving, something that's not moving that they can compare it to. If you find that the bullet on the other side is the one that went through the body, then you can take that trajectory and basically hang the person's body trajectory on that line. So, what will limit within the scene where the particular part of the shooting could have occurred? That will limit the scene. That will limit within the scene where the particular part of the shooting could have occurred. So it'll give you a better understanding of where it took place. And is that helpful? Because if there was, sorry, is that helpful? Because if there was another bullet hole that had no exit and had no way to align it to anything fixed at the scene, you would have no idea where at the scene the person was when they were shot. That's right. The only thing that you might look at, and it's one thing that can be misleading, is blood paths. A lot of times people look at a scene and they see where all the blood in is, and then they think, uh-huh, that's where it happened. But frequently you don't see a lot of blood until the person is down on the ground. Who was it who told us that some of these wounds don't really bleed that much? I can't remember. I think it was Dr. Fackler who told us that he was the one that did the pig experiments as well, shooting into the pig's thighs and whatnot. I think, and he said that sometimes you just don't bleed. Like it doesn't cause that much bleeding because you're going straight through muscle so quickly, and it doesn't, you're not catching like arteries or whatever. So a lot of times you don't get a lot of blood until after the fact. after the shooting, or like this guy is saying, after you lay down until the person is down on the ground. Or you don't see much and you may not even see a trail, or it may not start hitting the ground until there's been a fair amount of movement. So, you have to take into consideration what may be happening with this wound before it gets to the point where blood is affecting the scene. And so each one of these things has is complicated by those kinds of factors of something if of something happens like a gunshot wound. Okay. What's the next thing that happens? And then how does that affect what you see as a result of that shooting? Now, there has been suggested in this courtroom the notion that a complete reconstruction can be done based on this crime scene with its evidence. What is your opinion with respect to that notion? Well, it would be pretty amazing to me if a complete reconstruction could be done with all of the evidence that might have been available from a crime scene. In this situation, there's quite a bit missing. There are all of the shot shells are missing, some of the shot pellets and wadding are missing, so there's some evidence that's missing. You also have a number of shots here which have no points to relate to outside of the body. In other words, they basically go through the body, but you have no way of knowing where they go after they leave the body. The evidence, it's clear that this occurrence was within a fairly limited area. The result has been that most of the evidence is in that area and it's mixed together, and so trying to sort out that evidence is very difficult, and particularly since portions of it were not well documented and portions of it were not collected. That's a great answer. Does reconstruction of a shooting, by definition, require opinions or conclusions about the sequence of shots if you have a multiple shot shooting? I'm not sure I understand your question. Okay. Would you say there are various kinds of, or there are different questions that you can hope to answer by examining the physical evidence from a crime scene? Yes. Is one of the questions that one can routinely answer questions having to do with the sequence, in what order shots were fired in multiple cases? That's one of the more difficult things to determine because if you have a number of shots to a body, unless there's a difference between them in terms of whether they're antemortem or postmortem, there's really nothing to tell them apart. Occasionally, and this is where I get called into the coroner's office on occasion, is where you have multiple shots of the skull or an area where you have bone fractures. And the bone fracture was sometimes one fracture where the first bullet goes down and the second one comes, and the fractures from that one run into the fractures from the first one. In that situation, you could say this one was first and this one was second. Well, how can you do that? Because you have the ability to show that the fracture lines, one set of fracture lines occurred and another one ran into it. It wouldn't run into it if it wasn't already there. We see the same thing in glass fractures. Sometimes you can associate glass fractures. Even there, you have to be very careful because sometimes when other things are happening, and typically these things are relatively complex events that involve a lot of factors, which you what you can have is you can have something that is fired, a bullet is fired, and then you get subsequent extensions of cracks. So that one that was actually there later then develops a crack that gets run into one that gets run into by one. This is very confusing language. That runs into one that gets run into by one that was there actually sooner. And so you have to be careful of things like that. In your opinion, Mr. Morton, after being on this case for these 3 years, do you believe that a scientifically valid reconstruction of this crime scene, to the extent of determining the position of the decedents and the position of the shooter or shooters at the time each decedent received their various wounds, is possible? No. And is that an opinion that you reached in 1993? I didn't look at it critically from the standpoint of trying to reconstruct it and put it all together, but it's not something that I would have done. And why not? Because it was, obviously, Such a crime scene that to try to do that, to attempt to do that, would be very time consuming and expensive, and it probably wouldn't contribute anything to the investigation. What do you mean by it wouldn't contribute anything? Well, it wouldn't tell anything that would make a significant difference in the investigation or the prosecution of the defense of this case as far as I could see. Well, you're aware of what Dr. McCarthy claims to have been able to recreate or reconstruct in this case, are you not? Yes. And what is your opinion concerning the scientific validity of his work? Objection asked and answered, overruled. And I think it's rife with errors and assumptions. False assumptions? Yes, and assumptions that I don't know how to make, that we don't normally make in this business about what people are thinking and what they are attempting to do and what they are aiming at necessarily. He made a lot of speculative determinations in his analysis. Dr. McCarthy did. So in that, you're referring to things that appeared in his report that he did not testify about. Is that correct? That's correct. And with respect to those things, however, that he did testify about, were those matters also rife with errors and assumptions that people in your field of expertise do not engage in? I believe so. Were you able to strike that? You were in the courtroom when Mr. Linhart and Deputy Van Horn testified, were you not? Yes. And you heard, did you not, some opinions and conclusions that they were able to reach about some of the evidence in this case? Yes. Were you likewise able to formulate some opinions, come to some conclusions about some things with respect to the position, particularly of the decedents, that occurred here or may probably have occurred here? I think there's some strong evidence to support certain elements of the relationship between the participants, if you will, or the people involved in this incident. And could you tell us what you think is the strongest evidence supporting certain elements of relationship? I mean, in other words, are there things in examining the physical evidence that you feel you can indicate with some confidence happened or didn't happen? Yes. There are certain things in the blood spatter and the injury patterns that make pretty strong arguments for parts of the reconstruction of this. Okay. And could you tell us then, could you start with what opinions you have by the way of your efforts to to reconstruct this homicide? Yes, the starting off with this issue of Jose Menendez. Oh, he said Joseph, and she corrected him and said it's Jose. By the way, the coroner wrote Joseph, but it's Jose. And then he corrects himself and says Jose. I think there's strong evidence to support the idea that he was standing at the time he was shot through the leg and he was facing the sofa at the time. Facing the sofa at the time. And that he rotated and dropped in a position where he subsequently was shot in the head. Interesting. So he was shot from behind, in this doctor's opinion, while he was facing the sofa. That would make a whole lot of sense to me. And I've always thought that they were standing not like in any particular way facing the door, but however they would. So maybe Kitty was like leaning on the arm of the couch and talking to Jose, and Jose was, you know, facing her. And then they walk in behind Jose and start firing because they just started firing. And of course, them entering the room is going to make them turn. So as Jose's turning, he's turning and the boys are probably already starting to fire or in the process of beginning to fire. And so that movement, they're all going to be startled, when the door opens. So they're going to move to look towards the door. So they probably were in an original position. Then they looked towards the door when the event started, and then they moved in many positions before they ended in their final positions. And for the state to say, yeah, we know exactly how it all happened, I just don't buy that. Anyways, so this guy says that Jose was facing the sofa at the time and that he rotated and dropped in a position where he was subsequently shot in the head. I want to go through a list of these things before we go back and discuss them in detail. What other opinions did you form with which you have a high degree of confidence? With regard to the two birdshot wounds, they appear to be either contact or very close, and the last of the shots, at least relative to Mary Menendez. I can't say that the shot to Mr. Menendez's head would have been before or after that. And what else can you say with respect to either your own conclusions or with respect to disagreement with the conclusions that Dr. McCarthy came up with? I think there is no evidence to establish whether the shot through Mary Menendez's head, which apparently went into her face and clavicle, was while she was on the ground or when she was standing. Could have been while she was standing. The shot to her arm, the physical evidence that I examined. Well, let me stop you there. When you say the shot to her arm, you're talking about the one that coroner calls wound 5? Yes. Okay. Involves both her forearm and her upper arm. Examination of the bracelet parts in that on that is, I think, on that wound show that the bracelet had been impacted with lead and broke, and the three pieces ended up on the other side of the sofa. One of them close to a hole in the window, the east door of one of the doors of the south wall, and one of them on the sofa next to Jose. And what did and that, to me, indicated that she was standing and that shot occurred while she was standing. But that's a good example of a case of a shot where you have something outside the body to relate a trajectory to. So the clear bracelet that she was wearing provides more context of where she might have been standing. And what was it that was outside of the body? Oh, no, I was wrong. It wasn't the bracelet. She asked what was it that was outside of the body that would help to relate a trajectory to that shot. There was wadding, pellet, a hole through the window, and spatter all in the same area around that hole. And you're talking about the same area that contained a piece of the bracelet? That's correct. And the particular piece of the bracelet that had lead on it? Yes. Now, did you initially, in 93, form the tentative conclusion that there was lead on that bracelet based on the physical appearance of the rather lead on that piece of the bracelet based on the physical appearance of that piece of the bracelet? Yes. And without hauling out the charts right now, is it your understanding that that whole cluster of physical evidence, the piece of the bracelet with lead, the wadding, the pellet that was next to the east door and under the blood spatter, was labeled by the Beverly Hills Department item 21? That's correct. And have you subsequently, just to confirm your opinion, done actual chemical tests on the piece of the bracelet to determine whether the smear that was on it was in fact lead? Yes. Actually, in looking at the photograph, there looked like there was a little bit of red or brownish residue associated with it, and I was curious about that and wanted to make sure it was in fact lead. So I got the items out of both that item, which is 21, and item 5 and item 16, which are the other two pieces of the bracelet, and reconstructed the bracelet. And it showed that I wanted to see one of the things I wanted to see is if you have a break, if you have an object that's broken by something and the residue goes right up to the edges of the break, then if you look at the other piece and you should be able to see lead going right up to the edge as well. In other words, if you have it on both sides. If you don't see it on both sides, if you have both sides and one of them shows it and the other one doesn't, that suggests that that got on there afterwards, after the break took place. So I wanted to make that and see if there was evidence of that. And was there? Well, what happened was in putting it together, I could see that there were actually one of the pieces was 5 was actually 2 pieces, I believe, and it had a third piece that was missing. So the piece adjacent to the portion that had lead on it was actually broken out completely. So probably it was not collected or hit or whatever. So did you confirm that that had been hit by the pellets or pellets? By a pellet or pellets? Yes. So that piece that that was broken out all completely was hit by pellets, he says. And did you perform a chemical test on the piece of bracelet that was part of item 21 that still had what looked like a lead smear on it? Yes. I performed a sodium rhodazonite, rhodaz, rhod, rhodazonite, whatever test, which is a standard test for lead, which we use for determining firing distances and other firearm related issues when you're interested in lead. And what was the result of that test? It was positive. Positive for lead? Yes. Did you note, by the way, in Dr. McCarthy's proposed reconstruction, that he had offered both in his report and, in fact, in his testimony and in his illustrations, no explanation whatsoever for what caused the hole in the east door of the French doors? That's correct. Was there any other aspect of the physical evidence in this case that you felt you could form certain conclusions about, either positive or negative, if you will, that things either did happen or couldn't have happened? Yes. It was clear from, and Mr. Linhart discussed this, the issue that she must have been standing at some point after the bleeding started because there was blood on the bottom of her, particularly blood on the bottom of her right shoe, to a lesser extent on the bottom of her left shoe, and substantial dripping on her left shoe. And in your opinion, the substantial dripping in her left shoe suggests that she may indeed have been shot in the leg and standing after the leg shot. Objection, leading, overruled. The witness says, it did suggest that, yes. Ms. Amerson says, I need a moment to talk to Mr. Gessler. So they confer just for a second. And then she goes on and says, Mr. Morton, do you have your notebook up there with you? Yes. Do you have a copy of your notes that uh, the report that you provided to me? The review of Mr. McCarthy's thing. I turned mine over to someone else and they didn't give me back a copy. The witness says, I have. This was an early review before we actually got a chance to look at the CD-ROM, as I recall, and I made some notations on it that have changed. Some additional notations? Yes, I don't remember. Did I give you this? This is a synopsis. She says, well, I had an earlier version of that synopsis which you indicated you needed to correct. Have you since corrected it? Actually, I have not changed it. Okay, did you ever form an opinion with respect to failure analysis work concerning what they call the shot number 1 and all the various components of that? Yes. And what was your opinion concerning their shot number 1? It was impossible because it incorporated parts of shots that were going in opposite directions. Interesting. Did you find anything in the physical evidence to support the notion that Mrs. Menendez received, let's see, what does he claim, 6 shots while on the ground? No. Did you in fact examine carefully the photographic evidence to see if there was pellets or other debris in areas where you would expect it to be if the failure analysis illustrations were at all accurate concerning shots that she supposedly received on the ground? And this is with exception to the bird shots. That area was such a mix of evidence from obviously a number of wounds that I don't know that I could accurately have seen it, but it was the one wound to the left thigh, I think. It was number 7. Yes, it was Dr. Golden's number 7, you mean? Yes, but I had a problem. There was no residue in the area where that would have ended up, but before that, I had a problem with that being an entry wound. It just did not have the appearance of an entry wound. You're talking about what Dr. Golden described in his original report as the entry wound, being on the top or front. Nobody's going to see that on the top or front part of the leg? Yes. Now, you're aware that Dr. Fackler has testified that, in fact, in his opinion, that's the exit wound, not the entry wound? Yes. The way that failure analysis diagrammed it, however, they made I don't remember what he called it. He made the top the entry and the bottom the exit and had that shot coming from from an easterly direction. Is that your recollection? Yes. Yes, this is what Dr. McCarthy called 8, and it purported to show the shot coming in from the top of the thigh and out the bottom and towards the back. Yes. So, did you initially look to see if these are photographs that visualize this area of what would be that area of the rug? That's correct. And that's not an area that's steeped in pools of blood, as is the area, for example, underneath Mrs. Menendez that becomes visible after her body was removed. Is that correct? That's correct. Did you see, first of all, any indication in that area of blowout from such a wound? No. And But at some point, did you determine that that was wrong because the entry and the exit is confused anyway? Yes. And was that something that occurred to you on your own initially? No. Did you consult with medical experts to determine whether the entry and exit had been confused, both apparently by Dr. Golden and then by Dr. McCarthy? Yes. And who were the medical experts that you consulted with concerning that wound? Dr. Fackler. But in going back and looking at it, the configuration of that wound, it's isolated pellets and wadding underneath the skin, and you have sort of an initial control in that scene in terms of shot what those shots appear like. What do you mean by that? Well, the shot through Mr. Menendez's leg, you saw how large that wound was. This is a rather mild wound, if you will, at what's supposed to be the entry hole, and the configuration of if this was a more distant shot where the pellets are separated, as they appear to be, there would be uh, they would show a more uniform appearance. These are rather irregular, or rather irregular looking. So it's not like I would expect to see from a series of pellets which have spread enough because they're at a great distance. You're saying if it were an entry and if the separation of holes was because it was being fired from such a distance that the spread that, for example, Deputy Van Horn was talking about had occurred, you would expect to see more regularity in the size and placement of the holes? Correct. And it doesn't strike that. Is such a regular pattern observable, for example, on the left breast wound, number 6 to Mrs. Menendez? No. So does that alone, the appearance of those different holes of different sizes and different relationship to each other from the top of the thigh, did that suggest to you, even without medical advice, that that probably wasn't an entry site? Yes, that's correct. And the other wound that's associated with that on her left leg, which is just one large hole, did you form an opinion about whether that was more typical of a shotgun entry site? That I left to, there was some indication of scalloping at the edge of it, suggested that. The thing that threw me was the description that Dr. Golden had in his autopsy report around what he called the entry wound, and that was something I'm not medically qualified to evaluate, and I felt Dr. Fackler or a pathologist would have to deal with that. And he talked about some kind of abrasion around it? Yes. Did you look at the photographs? Yes. Did you see any abrasion around it? I don't like to evaluate those kinds of medical issues on my own. All right. Are you aware, excuse me, I'm sorry, cold, but it's liquid. Thank you. I don't know what that was in reference to. Oh, maybe uh, she wanted something to drink and somebody gave her something that was cold, but she wanted something warm. I have no idea. She says cold, but it's liquid. Thank you. You're aware that Dr. Wecht was formulated certain or has formulated certain conclusions about the medical evidence in this case. I understand he's involved. I'm not aware of what his observations are. All right, if I were to offer you hypothetically for you to assume that Dr. Wecht is of the opinion, as well as Dr. Fackler, that that wound on her left leg, Dr. Golden's description has the entry and exit reversed, that the entrance is the one that's lower down and to the back, and the exits are these individual irregular sized holes. Does that further confirm your own opinion about that wound? Yes. Do you believe that there's any way in this case to determine the sequence of all of the shots? No. Do you think that there was sufficient evidence for Dr. McCarthy to rely on do you think that there was sufficient evidence for Dr. McCarthy to rely on for him to assert that other than the bird shot, that certain wounds were inflicted on Mrs. Menendez while she was lying down in one position or another? The low direction of the shots to the left leg both suggest that that would be a possibility. Is that, I'm sorry? As far as the others, there's nothing to suggest the individual would be lying down when those occurred. And in respect to the shots to the left leg, is there anything that determines that if indeed Mrs. Menendez was lying down when she received them, that she was lying on the floor rather than lying on the couch? You have very mobile limbs. I would think that you could get correspondence in either one of those. So you can't rule one out over the other? That's correct. And are you aware of, well, you've said you've read Dr. Fackler's testimony and Dr. Lawrence's testimony, in fact, and you're aware of the association that Dr. Fackler made between the graze wound to her left calf and the thigh wound that we've been talking about. Yes. And is there anything in that physical evidence that would rule out that graze thigh combination occurring while Mrs. Menendez is leaning back on the couch? I don't know that. It would require a relatively low shot, but that's possible. Well, wouldn't it require even a lower shot if she was lying on the floor for that? Yes. So it would be a higher shot if she's on the couch. Well, you get into what the position is of the gun relative to where the evidence would end up after it went through there. And that's the problem in trying to relate these things, is where a lot of the evidence ends up is confused. So it's really hard to track where the evidence ends up from most of these wounds. Yes. And would you want to be able to do that with some degree of certainty before you, as a forensic scientist, would ever claim that a wound occurred in a particular place? Yes. I mean, there might have been evidence at the scene to help answer some of these questions, but it's not a criticism of the investigation. These are complex investigations and sometimes things get overlooked. Have you? But there may have been some evidence there that would help resolve some of these, but in this case, we don't have that information. So it wasn't gathered. Correct. As a criminalist and a forensic scientist, Mr. Morton, would you assume that a multiple decedent, multiple shooter, multiple shotgun round case such as this would ever be attempted to be reconstructed on a sequence, on an exact location, exact sequence of shots? Well, you can't attempt to do anything. Okay. But I mean, did you think somebody, in terms of a realistic effort to try to, I mean, you can't attempt to do that. And sometimes you might attempt it to see if it's possible, to see if there are elements that are definable, but you don't just, when you come to a point where you've got a number of different options, you don't just pick one of them and go ahead as if it's the only possibility. What it does is it says, okay, we've got this part, but now this one we have to be careful of because there are several options at this juncture. And we can say, we don't say, well, one's 55%, the one's 50%, I'll take that one because These things aren't just a matter of which is slightly more likely, these are a matter of what actually happened. Well, nobody knows what actually happened. What we're trying to do is reconstruct as much as possible what the limits are on defining what it is that did happen. And can you think of anything in the literature or anything within the forensic community that would have told the investigating officers here that it is necessary for them to pick up every pellet or to do work or to take apart the couches or do more than they actually did here? Well, I mean, it's actually nice to do the work I do Monday morning quarterbacking and say, you really should have picked up everything. It would be nice. But as I taught when I was teaching at Cal State LA, every crime scene has an infinite amount of evidence, and what you need to do is attempt to collect as much of that as possible as is important. And usually that's everything that looks like it's associated with the crime. But sometimes you have to recognize that unless you have the time and the resources to do it, that's going to be a long and time consuming effort. And it may be that what you're going to gain by that is not worth the effort. For example, in the Robert Kennedy assassination, there was an argument over doing neutron activation analysis. Would you tell the jury what that is? It's a technique where materials are bombarded with neutrons and they're made radioactive, and the radiation allows you to characterize what the elements are in this material. So it's basically just an analytical technique. It was going to be the solution to all of the problems back in the 60s, and like so many solutions to all of our problems, it didn't work out that way. It was one that was being promoted at the time, and was it being promoted as a way to match, for example, a bullet that has entered the body of someone with a potential source for that bullet? It was going to match everything, he says. Oh, everything. Hair. You could be able to tell somebody's hair from trace analysis, that type of thing. Any material could be traced, excuse me, any material could be traced, analyzed, and found to compare to something else. Then they actually went into court with some of it, which I was a little distressed with. But they finally realized that it was not able to do that. So it was not reliable. It wasn't able to do what they were saying it was doing. But the question came up in the Robert Kennedy assassination of, well, shouldn't you do everything when you have a senator, a presidential candidate, who's been murdered? Shouldn't you do everything possible? And my answer is no, because in that case, if you did the analysis, if it came out one way, it wouldn't give you any answer that was different if it came out the other way, because if you showed there were identical if you showed they were identical, it wouldn't mean they were from the same manufacturer. If you showed that they were different, it wouldn't mean that they were from the different box of ammunition. So, okay, if you do this analysis and you come up with the same answer, then don't. Why do it? And how do you analogize that, and how do you analogize that to what was done here? Well, if you get to a point where you've collected the evidence that will allow you to answer most of the questions that are evident at that time, then stop. But in this situation, there was so much evidence, I think there was just not enough that was collected, and it wasn't based on the decision that that it wasn't necessary. It wasn't based on the decision that it wasn't necessary. Okay. Well, even if the Beverly Hills Police Department had, for example, collected every pellet in the pool of blood under Mrs. Menendez, would that, in that pool area, would that have actually been able to tell you where the shots originated from? Well, it works both ways. In other words, if you documented it properly and collected everything, then you'd be able to answer some of these questions that are sort of left there for guessing right now. For example, the issue of whether or not this shot through her leg went through her leg and then into the carpet in that area, that we don't see any evidence of. if that section of carpet had been cut out, or if the carpet had been lifted up to see if there are any holes below, and you could show that, you know clearly that that was not the way that or that that was not the way that it happened. So you'd be able to answer that question directly. You'd either be able to determine if it did or didn't happen that way. So sometimes what's not there can be as important as what is there. So it is important to collect things like the carpet underneath where the bullet might have ended up, or portions of the couch that they never collected. I mean, they didn't collect the couch. How do you not collect the couch when the body was on the couch and you didn't collect it? I just, I mean, there were pieces of tissue that they're trying to claim as tissue and all these things, and we don't even know. It wasn't collected, it wasn't tested. So how can you prove your theory of the crime if you're not going to test the actual evidence of the crime? Anyways, um, Ms. Aronson says, on that happy note, Your Honor, the court says, all right, we'll resume tomorrow at 8:30. Don't discuss the matter with anyone. Don't call or don't form any final opinions about it. We'll see you back here at 8:30. And they are adjourned for the day. So we will resume with December 1st's testimony, continuing on with Dr. Morton in the next episode. So thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate you, and I will see you in the next one. Take care. Bye now.